question that you learn to expect. What is your call story? That always got me. So many people have their stories of the aha moments. Or you hear the story of Luther in the forest and the lightning and thunder. Or then there's the ones that are there talking about their tales of distributing communion to their teddy bears. Or everyone else is having tea parties with their stuffed animals. And I was always stumbling around, where did it begin? So I always turn it to my baptism, because that was one thing I could remember. But if I look back on what were those points? One of them was actually in a college class on African history. It was all intersecting right around the time of 9/11. I was making a trip out to Tanzania. And then I'm in this class reading about early Christian missionaries and the destruction that our forefathers and ancestors caused on that continent. And I was always asking the question, what are we doing now? What's the difference? How is my faith affected by this? And I didn't want that to be a representation of my faith, and I couldn't shake it. And the thing that I couldn't shake about it is because some of this stuff that I was reading wasn't locked into the past, but continues to happen among many believers today, as they seek to justify and live out the religious faith authentically, through cruelty and bigotry, relying on junk science to justify their superiority, turning to political intervention to oppress, or even resorting to violence in an effort to strike fear into those they disagree with. Us versus them. All of this done in the name of Christ, or in the name of Allah, or just in the name of God. It can begin enough to drive out skeptics, the seekers, or even believers themselves as far from religion as possible. The Apostle Paul knew this flavor of religion very well. In his former life, he could have been considered a religious terrorist, seeking to destroy anyone who he believed opposed God's ways, according to him. He dragged believers from their homes to have them arrested. He supported the killing of Stephen, our first Christian martyr. He worked zealously to destroy the church. But in this letter today, which we heard the beginning of last week, in his strongly worded opening to the letter to the Galatians, today we hear that God called him through his grace. Paul was not out seeking a new job. He was pretty good at the one he'd done. He wasn't looking to make a new direction or change in his life. In fact, he didn't even think that he should be called an apostle because of what he had been doing. But it was in those very cracks, his previous life, where the light of Christ began to shine through. Today, we hear a little bit of Paul's call story to these people whom he had brought the faith to. He was hoping to share his call story so they might understand their own call story. He said, yes, God set me apart before I was even born. Yet God also set you apart before you were born. He called you through the gift of grace. Powerful stuff. That God has even set you apart before you were born and called you through Christ with the gift of grace. Maybe some of you have had these moments, have been called. Maybe it's been an aha moment for you. Maybe you're still waiting for a call. Paul's conversion was dramatic. It turned from this violent aggression to a repudiation of hatred in all its forms and a demonstration of this indiscriminate love for all people. Paul was arguably the most influential Christ follower who never had the chance to meet Jesus. He shared his faith story to encourage the Galatians to examine their own experiences for signs of God's call. In all of this, as we're looking at it during our month in the book of Galatians in our Bible study, the underlying issue for this community revolved around whether the Gentile believers had to become Jewish, mostly through circumcision, just to be part of God's family. But Paul said no. Absolutely not. He said, if this is what we're using to judge faith, then Christ's suffering and death and resurrection do not matter. A little later on, he talks about going to Jerusalem, meeting with Peter and some of the other disciples who are bringing this message of the continuation of some of these practices. And he said, I don't agree with it. There was only one thing that they sent me away with, was to remember the poor. And he was excited about doing that. It's what Jesus demonstrated today with the young man and his mother, responding to the very vulnerable, seeking to erase the instance of devastation and survival from her hands, pointing to those disciples and everyone around them. See, we need to be caring for the widow, for the poor. Paul turns his own call story as a way to reinforce this radical message of Christ's love. He wants to make sure that the Galatians do not turn away from the freedom of the gospel just to be accepted by certain people, or pressured into unnecessary requirements of faith. God has set you apart before you were born, called you through this gift of grace. It's by understanding this call from God, that gives us a framework, our starting point on which we can move forward, to be continued to be transformed as we shed the death from our own lives, so that we may have the opportunity to bring new life to others. So these call stories that we were hounded about in seminary, they're really just part of all of our stories. For you to think about, what is your call story? How has God called you in this day? Because we're all called to share in God's work in this world. Each of us, called in various ways by God to break down the barriers, to keep others who are seeking hope in this world that feeds on fear. Each of us has the opportunity to hear a call, to share the good news through our lives. And part of that came before we were even born. God was there, setting you apart for this work in the world.